Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. My name is Ilham Nasser and I'm the senior researcher in charge of the empirical study at IIIT that we call Mapping the Terrain. The Human Development Series started earlier this year with a review of the rationale for adopting a human development approach to advancing education Muslim societies initiative of IIIT and what we call AEMS. The human development has been the basis for the empirical research we carry through the study and the research and in other programs. The second webinar we had focused on the dynamic nature of the human development and how it explains states of consciousness as they are articulated in the spiral dynamic model and states of consciousness. Today, we focus on adult education and development. With us today, Professor Coryell, a leading scholar in the area who will help us understand how adults learn and develop across the lifespan, and how to engage their learning in becoming more worldly, more cosmopolitan. Dr. Coryell will be drawing upon theory and some of her own research and practice with adult learning at home, in the US and abroad. Dr. Joellen Coryell is a professor of adult, professional, and community education and assistant dean for educational partnerships, the enrollment for the College of Education and Texas State University. She holds a BA in International Economics from the University of Illinois, an MED in Curriculum and Instruction, and English as a second language from Texas State University. Her PhD is in educational human resource development with a concentration in adult education, also from Texas A&M University. Her research focuses on international cross-cultural adult higher education and the investment in the professional development of adult educators and leaders. Her current research is in faculty and instructional development during higher education internationalization in Italy and adult study abroad. She has worked extensively in Italy as well as Malawi and New Zealand. She is a former Fulbright scholar to Italy and is the faculty lead on a memorandum of understanding with the University of Padova. I hope I'm pronouncing Padova correctly, in Italy. Professor Coryell will share her presentation with us for about 40 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. On your screen, you will see the chat function as well as the Q&A. Professor Coryell will paste a question at the start for you to entertain in the chat where you can respond to her question. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions, and we will try our best to address all the questions during that period. For safety reasons, video and audio are not available during this webinar. Finally, this presentation will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel or our website. If you are not on our mailing list, remember to sign up so you will remain informed. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Professor Coryell, for being here with us and giving us your time. Thank you so much. Please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Ilham. I appreciate that lovely introduction. And it is a distinct pleasure of mine to be here with you all today. I'm so impressed with all of the different places where people are hailing from and zooming in with us today. And it's just a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you. I'm gonna just take a moment to share my screen, and we can get started. Okay, so I will go in a moment back to the question that I'll put in the chat. But again, the title of my talk today is Adult Learning, Development, and Cosmopolitanism, Theoretical and Practical Insights from the Discipline of Adult Education. Today's itinerary, because I think about globalization and cosmopolitanism as a matter of travel. Sometimes we can physically travel, much more before COVID, of course. But other times our travel is intellectual, psychological, emotional, as we learn about ourselves and about others. So today's itinerary is, we'll first talk a little bit about globalization and cross-cultural learning. and storytelling, and then a little bit about the field of adult education, which has a very long history, but is a more recent academic discipline. We'll talk then about some theoretical foundations for learning, adult learning and development, and as well as cosmopolitanism, and then some practical implications for cosmopolitan adult learning and development. So in the Zoom chat, if you would please write out one hope or goal for your learning in today's session, now that you've heard about what we're doing today. If you would think about why you decided to register for this conversation, and what maybe in the chat, if you could look at or you could write in a hope or a goal that you have for your time here today. I'll give you a few minutes and I'll go into the chat to see what some of those reasons are. So I see we have some ideas about how to grow intellectually, think from a new perspective, how to make learning fun all the time. That's a good question. To get strong motivation for continued learning, great. Keep abreast of the latest research findings about adult education, okay. Any other ideas? Global overview of adult learning with a touch of a comparative analysis, okay. We're not spending a lot of time on comparative education today, but I'll try to add some things in there as we go. Be more familiar with adult education's development in recent modern materialism, okay. I think this is a question I don't know about attendance or a certificate. Perhaps Ilham can chime in there. Social methods, okay, encouragement. There's andragogy. We are going to talk about andragogy today. Thank you, Shaki. Personal development, super. We'll take a few more and then we'll move into explaining why I asked you about this. Someone says just to learn a few new things. Yeehaw! That's very welcoming for a Texan. Get knowledge to apply in daily life. I do think that we're going to be talking a bit about that as well. Okay, so thank you so much for engaging in this chat session with me today. You know, my preference, of course, is I think a lot of people's preferences is to be face-to-face, is to interact, to see people's faces, to hear their stories, and to be able to engage in communication that is more than just the sounds of voices. But as we know, we can't quite do that right now. So by utilizing this chat, what it does, I did this for a couple of reasons. First, it's helpful for me to understand some of the goals that you may have, so I can, if possible, tailor my conversation with you. And if some of the goals are not within the scope of the presentation, then we can talk about extension afterwards that may help in meeting those goals. Second, I ask for you to do this because I want you to reflect on the topic at hand. I want you to be thinking about what you already know about adult learning, about cosmopolitanism and globalization, and what you're hoping to learn. This is something that we do as an adult education to have people start to reflect already on the topic, to think about what they already know so that they can situate new knowledge or new understandings or new phenomena into their knowledge schema that they have already brought up and able to use for learning. So next, here I'm going to put some words up that people around the world are talking about, experiencing, arguing about, and certainly researching in adult education. Some heavy and heady words here and ideas and terms here, but I think they all come into play when we think about our lives in the world today as a global community as well as in our local communities. So we have been experiencing globalization for quite some time now. Globalization we can define as a process of interaction and integration among the people, companies, and governments of different nations, a process driven by international trade, and investment, travel and tourism, and aided by information technology. This process that has effects on our environment, on the culture, on our political systems, and on economic development and prosperity, as well as on the human physical well-being in societies around the world. As well, our current global contexts include economic, political, and societal forces that are pushing 21st century education toward greater international involvement. So this discussion leads us to our thoughts about learning and globalization as concepts that are really integrated, I should say. So while globalization is not new, and there are positive and negative aspects about it for sure, it is a reality and one that demands our thinking about who and how we want to be in the world today. So I think when we travel, whether physical travel, intellectual travel, emotional, so on, through our work interactions, or virtual traveling through social media, through the news, in Zoom discussions like this one, etc. We bring not only our clothes or shoes or travel documents and our other trimmings, we also bring our frames of reference. These are our cultural values, our behaviors, our expectations, our interactions and communication styles, and our curiosities, our hopes, our needs and expectations. Hopefully, we're also bringing a willingness to interact, to listen, to share, and to learn. What more do you want to learn is the question that we ask our adult learners when we are engaged in adult education. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my story to give you some background about me. So I was born in this state. This is North Dakota. And subsequently, my family moved to these states by the time I turned 18 because my father was in the Air Force, and we moved every couple of years. People have often asked me how I got through all of that moving, and wasn't it hard? And I will say that yes, it was hard, certainly, but I think it is also very influential in who I am today, in that by moving all across the country in different, and interacting and learning and living in different places with seriously different cultures across the United States. While English tended to be the dominant language, there were differences in dialects, differences in words, differences in values, differences in fears and expectations and hopes and dreams. And I started to find that very, very interesting. I also learned to make friends pretty quickly. I'm fairly social and maybe an extrovert. So these kinds of things were important for me to get to know people as soon as possible. I have friends because we'd be moving very quickly afterwards. And I learned at this time, during my growing up years, that my grounding was really my immediate family, which was not very big. It's just my parents and my brother, but that they were my foundations as we moved to different places. They were my familiarity. They were my consistency. Then when I was 21 and a junior in college at the University of Illinois, I studied at an Italian language school for foreigners in Florence, Italy. And it was called Centro Linguistico Italiano Dante Alighieri. It was during this time that I really learned a lot about myself. I was in all Italian classes for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, to learn the language and of course about the culture of Italy. I was there for 4 months, and we completed the equivalent of 4 semesters of Italian during that time, so it's fairly intense. It was during that semester that I was really forced to think about who I was and who I wanted to be in ways that I hadn't before. My grounding, which was my immediate family, wasn't there, and I was very, very, very lonely. There was no internet or cell phones at that time, and for someone who had moved around the country, you might think I was I'd be very well prepared for this, but I struggled immensely to fit in, not just because I didn't speak any Italian before I got there, but also because, and therefore I couldn't communicate, but also because culturally life was really very different. Certainly food and clothes and fashion, money, interaction, expectations, queuing, music, everything was just so very different, but I was falling in love with these differences. And just as I just ended up having to do it in silence for the first 6 weeks because for those of you who know things about language acquisition or foreign language acquisition, there's a silent period that many learners go through where they take in the language, but they don't really speak. That was definitely my experience, which was hard for someone who would, as I said, people might consider extroverted and social. That semester was seriously transformational for me, in that I can trace back many of my subsequent beliefs, attitudes, and choices. Oh, that's my phone talking to me. Choices back to their the origins of when I was in Italy, living and learning. These kinds of stories that I'm telling you now, including the silent period, I think are helpful in thinking about the intersection of adult learning, development, and cosmopolitanism during globalization of our world, as it is a metaphor for the importance of observing, listening, and learning when encountering new cultures and diverse peoples. By the end of my semester, I was communicating well in Italian, beginning to dream in Italian, and developing a commitment to learning as much as I could about Italians, their language, culture, cooking values, architecture, art, ways of life, probably a little wine in there as well. And my fascination in cultural diversity, my fascination with cultural diversity has certainly continued to grow. Finally, I want to give a little bit of background about my work experience, because I think that our work is very helpful in understanding who and why we are. Right after I got out of my undergraduate program, I was in executive sales and training. However, a number of years later, I had a child and realized that traveling 70% of the month was not so conducive to child rearing. So I ended up becoming a business instructor in vocational adult ed. I got my master's in curriculum instruction and taught ESL and K-12 higher education and community education across the lifespan. Now I'm a professor, as you know, of adult and professional and community education, and I teach in both master's and doctoral programs in that field. I take graduate students to Italy to study comparative adult and higher education. And as you know, I was a Fulbright Scholar to Italy in 1819. And currently I'm an assistant dean for educational partnerships and enrollment. This is a picture of a faculty professional development series that I conducted in Sicily last November with faculty from the University of Palermo. My faculty development consulting has been a big part of my life. So let's reflect on our own stories together as a group. If we were together in face-to-face, I would ideally have us in a number of round tables in which we could, you could be telling stories about your own experiences. I think it's important to tell those stories, or to at least think about them as we move forward. I told you about a time that I learned about a different culture, and so for a moment or two, I'd like for you to think about a time when you learned about a different culture that was really meaningful for you. Did it involve actual physical travel? Did it involve intellectual, psychological, or emotional travel? Who was there? What kinds of interactions did it entail? What is the story of this experience? So while we can't do this in our breakout tables, what I'd like for you to do is at least take a couple of moments to yourself and just think about a time in which you had a meaningful experience learning about a different culture. I'll give you a couple minutes and then we'll move on. Okay. So in terms of adult education, which we would define as learning development in adulthood, As you're glowing in the memory of your meaningful cross-cultural learning experience, I'd like to talk a bit about the field of adult ed. When people ask me what I teach at university, I tell them I teach adult ed, and usually their response is, what's that? I'd like to take a moment to explain a little bit about the discipline, which stems from an ancient practice we've been learning in adulthood, and people have been teaching adults since ancient times. But it is a fairly new academic discipline. The field of adult education is seriously wide in scope. Its focuses on access and social justice and social equity through education. There is a deep and rich body of knowledge with regard to theory, research, and practice in the field of adult education. Most of our formal programs in adult education, which are at the master's and doctoral levels only here in the United States, are on instructor development. So instructors of adults in their development. I'd like to go ahead and show a brief video about the foundation of adult education. And I'm hoping that you all can hear this. It's about a minute long. Okay. So the foundation of adult education is certainly in adult literacy, adult numeracy, family literacy, as well as adult secondary education. This is where adults can go to get the education needed to sit for exams like the GED and other high school equivalency experiences. But we also, in adult education, are looking at formal adult education, which includes all levels of university and college experiences, as well as vocational education. And we all, and those of us who are scholars are also, and practitioners are also looking at both non-formal and informal education. The difference between non-formal and informal education is this. Non-formal education are structured situations of education that often include a facilitator, an instructor, and then adult learners. But they don't necessarily lead to a certificate or diploma. Informal adult education is what we're doing every day as we live and learn. It can include self-directed experiences. It can include watching a podcast or a webcast and so forth. Community education, professional development and training, continuing education courses and workshops, study groups, health education, religious education, multicultural, cross-cultural education, fitness and self-help, and technical and web-based education are all easily situated within the field of adult education. And as an example, we have doctoral students who are in all of these, have interest in all of these areas and are conducting research in these areas to help us understand learning and teaching and development across the lifespan within these contexts. We have some theoretical foundations that I think are valuable to understand, and one of our participants indicated andragogy. We'll talk about andragogy a little bit, experiential learning a bit, as well as transformative learning, and as theories, as well as helping us to understand how best to facilitate learning in adulthood. And then we'll be going into cosmopolitanism. So andragogy, you've probably heard the word pedagogy, but for those of you who have not heard the word andragogy, it is defined as the art and science of helping adults learn. It was originally formulated by a teacher in Germany. His name was Alexander Kapp in 1833. Edward Lindemann in the United States wrote briefly about it in the 1920s, but it didn't really gain much traction at that time here. On the other hand, Malcolm Knowles brought it to our attention, and he is best known as the scholar who brought andragogy to the forefront of adult education as an academic discipline. His conception of andragogy was his attempt to build a model of adult learning that is anchored by characteristics of how adults learn. Knowles' model focuses on relationships derived from humanistic clinical psychology and good teaching and learning facilitation. His set of assumptions for adult learning include self-directedness. We understand, as a person matures, one's self-concept moves often from one of a dependent personality toward one that is more self-directing. Experience as a rich source of learning we understand that adults accumulate a growing reservoir experience, and those resources, that this experience is a really rich resource for learning. So we'll be able to situate new knowledge as adults into our previous knowledge or prior knowledge schemata. Adults need to know the reason for learning something. And they also have the need to have readiness to learn, which is closely related to the development of the tasks of his or her social role. These social roles include certainly work roles, but also relationship roles, position roles such as father, mother, spouse or partner, sister, brother, co-worker, community member, etc. The readiness of, the change, there is a change in time perspective as people mature from future application of knowledge to immediacy of application. Thus, an adult is really more problem-centered, we find, than subject-centered in their learning. And finally, adults are mostly driven by internal motivation rather than external motivators. I wanted to just stop for a moment and point out that I believe that there are there may be some questions that are coming through in the chat. And I understood that we'll be addressing some of those questions afterwards rather than along the way. So I hope that that's okay. So please go ahead and put any questions that you may have in the Q&A, and we will be able to address as many as possible toward the end. Experiential learning is another theory that we really talk a lot about in adult education. It also is talked about in childhood, in pedagogy as well, in childhood education. But in adulthood, we understand that our cache of experiences and our prior knowledge is really, really much larger even than that in childhood. And so Kolb's and Rogers are really the big names of theory in experiential adult learning. So this theory overlaps a bit with andragogy in that it talks about the importance of relevant experiences. Here I'd like to perhaps enhance our energies a bit by showing a brief video explanation of experiential learning.
Can you share audio, please?
Yes, I am so sorry. It appears I have not shared audio. Let me do that really quickly. Let's start this again.
So this video explores the notion of reflection, and it's based on the idea that as teachers we are engaged in a very practical activity, but that we often reflect on what we said and did in a particular session during or after the event, and that reflection might result in new ideas or conclusions about teaching that cause us to adapt our approach for the future. And this is something that we can do in a cyclical way aimed at improving our teaching on an ongoing basis. So we do something in our teaching, then we think about it, we draw some conclusions about it, and in light of those conclusions we adapt. And then, of course, we do it again to see what happens as a result of our adaptations. And then we think about that new experience and we draw new conclusions and perhaps adapt once more. And this process of learning from experience forms the basis for the ideas of David Kolb, who is an American educational theorist, born in 1939 and living in Ohio. He decided that he would describe each of the stages in the cycle, giving a very general title to each stage. so that the model can then be used by many people across a whole range of different contexts. Now, this naming of things to make them generally applicable is what we mean by theory, and Kolb here is trying to develop a theory of reflection. In other words, a reusable idea with broad applications, an abstract concept, if you like. Now, the names he came up with are as follows: concrete experience for the doing stage, reflective observation for the thinking stage, abstract conceptualization for the concluding stage, and active experimentation for the adapting stage. And this has become known as Kolb's reflective cycle. But remember, it's drawn from that real-life scenario of experiential learning that Kolb observed in the first instance. Now, my question for you in light of all this is this model useful? Could you write it into your next reflective task?
Okay. So the final adult learning theory that I want to talk about is transformative learning. Transformative learning can be described as moving from an unexamined or taken for granted way of thinking to a more examined and critically reflective way. The key tenets are frames of reference, which I mentioned a bit earlier, which include the cultural positionalities, values, understandings, and behaviors, socioeconomic circumstances, certainly spirituality and religious positionalities, and professional experiences. We've all experienced what Jack MEZIROW, who is the leading theorist in this theory, talks of as a disorienting dilemma, something that doesn't fit what we didn't expect to happen or to become real. During these disorienting dilemmas that we have in our lifetimes as adults, we then, if it's going to be transformative learning, we begin a self-examination where we look at those frames of reference. We start to critically assess our assumptions. And we realize that other people are doing this too, and that's a helpful thought process for us as we struggle with how our perspectives may need to be changed. During this time frame, we may be exploring new roles and relationships and actions, talking with other people, or doing so very personally and individually. And through reflection on the content and the process and the premises of our learning, this is when our perspectives can be actually transformed. And so this is the crux of transformative learning. Transformative learning is not something that we think happens all the time in adulthood, but we do know that it does happen, and it's an important concept of not formational learning as we do in childhood, but actually transforming our understandings once we have enough previous experiences and more firmed up frames of references to consider. So very quickly, I'd like for you to think about one of the best learning experiences that you've had as an adult. It doesn't necessarily need to be cross-cultural, but what were some of these, what have been some of the more meaningful experiences that you've had in learning as an adult? Once you've thought about one of those things, then imagine, was it informal education? So was it at university? Was it in a vocational education program? Or was it more informal or non-formal? What made this experience positive? And ultimately, was it experiential? Was it self-directed? Was it collaborative? Was it transformational? Could have been all of these. These kinds of reflections will help you to understand how adult learning theory and development theory can be applied to your own life. So next, let's talk a little bit about globalization and cosmopolitanism. One response to globalization has been the heightened awareness of cosmopolitanism as an identity or as a philosophy. Cosmopolitanism is defined as a philosophy and an ethical stance with an emphasis on a shared global community. We can think of it as a developmental project that values a shared human identity. Importantly, in this case, we're not talking about the cocktail or the magazine. Nativism, however, is another strong response that's been going on with globalization, particularly in our country, but also across the world. Nativism entails believing in a singular identity and having loyalty and responsibility to only those who identify in the same way, from the same place. Nativism includes policies as well that promote the interests of Native inhabitants against those of immigrants. Historically in our country, there are similarities between the nativism of the 1870s and the 1930s period and today, particularly the focus on a purported inability of specific immigrants to assimilate, the misconception that they may therefore be dangerous to the native-born population, and fear that immigration threatens American workers. There are also some key differences with nativism currently. And that is that the targets of nativism are now on undocumented immigrants and Muslim immigrants. And President Trump's consistent and highly public and widely disseminated appeals to nativist sentiment. Historical studies of nativism suggest that nativism does not disappear completely, but that there are cycles of nativism throughout communities, and that at time nativism will subside. Furthermore, immigrants themselves can and do adopt nativist attitudes, as well as their descendants. The focus of nativism is the belief that individuals, again, can only have a singular identity. But Bernard Leidigan observes that the idea of a singular or pure identity formed the bedrock of the sustained attempt over centuries to impose a divisive and unequal social structure along racial lines, leaving in its wake a deeply scarred humanity and an internally polarized society, steeped in mistrust and suspicion. The concept of a singular identity is limiting because it defines individuals as pre-existing in a condition beyond which they cannot go. It contains within itself the potential for violence because it is by nature exclusionary. There are also calls for a different response. And this is where we move to cosmopolitan solidarity and transculturality. Cosmopolitanism emphasizes a normative demand for inclusion and responsibility for each other beyond borders. Etymologically, cosmo means relating to the world, and polis is a sense of community. And cosmopolites is a citizen of the world. Cosmopolitanism has ancient origins and is discussed across the disciplines of ethics, philosophy, and education. It acknowledges there are universal values, cultures, and peoples. It emphasizes a shared global community with obligation to all people, regardless of nationality, kinship, or affection. Yet it also legitimizes differences. Appiah, Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is a New York University professor and an emeritus professor out of Princeton, have also suggested that we have obligations to others that stretch beyond those to whom we are related by the ties of kith and kin, or even the more formal ties of shared citizenship. We also must take seriously the value, not just of human life, but of particular human lives, which means taking an interest in the practices and beliefs that lend them in significance. There's a sense in which cosmopolitanism is the name not of the solution, but of the challenge. So what does it mean to be cosmopolitan? Lew and Nussbaum indicate that the cosmopolitan self is to be sensitive to global aid and other moral duties, and is also attentive to local accounts of subjectivity, emphasizing authenticity and embeddedness. And Papastefanou claims that the cosmopolitan self is a search for the kind of identity construction that adjusts to the situatedness and singularity of the self, while admitting that the self can always become enlarged and elastic enough to go beyond the binding historicity of one's own origin. We may respect differences without treating them as obstacles to a future reshuffling of identities or to an enlargement of one's self-understanding. There is not and cannot be only one definition of cosmopolitan. History has shown that there are many diverse and sometimes even contradictory forms. While I've defined generally what cosmopolitanism is, there are actually numerous types of cosmopolitanism found in the academic literature. These include cultural cosmopolitanism, moral cosmopolitanism, political cosmopolitanism, local cosmopolitanism, and economic cosmopolitanism. So cultural cosmopolitans reject exclusive attachments to a particular culture and encourage cultural diversity. They appreciate a multicultural mélange. They reject a strong nationalism. or nativism. They recognize the importance of individual cultural attachments, but they refuse a singular homogeneous identity. Moral cosmopolitans feel they have a duty to respect and value basic human rights for all humanity. Political cosmopolitans, on the other hand, focus on a centralized international political state or institution whose purview is to attend to global concerns that include things like poverty, war crimes, environmental concerns, and attention is on the individual and social institution, justice worldwide, and methods for achieving that justice. Local cosmopolitanism is an interesting example of something that's very different, because these folks focus on our local entrepreneurs who design their small businesses to appeal to Western tourists, like Americans, I assume, rather than for local consumers. And then finally, economic cosmopolitanism is very different. These folks assert the importance of promoting a single global economic market with free trade and minimal political involvement. This approach is normally characterized as neoliberal and endorsed more by economists and some politicians rather than philosophers. So for some theoretical implications for the practice of adult learning and teaching while learning with and from the world, there is a call to adult education and adults generally, fueled by commerce, technology, travel, politics, migration, environmental crises, and human equities. People all around the world encounter situations in which we really must interact to solve problems together, work collaboratively, and live in informed, supportive, and culturally sensitive ways. As such, colleagues and I have found adult education organizations across a wide scope of contexts are identifying international cross-cultural learning outcomes in their mission statements, visions, and practices. Because living in the world we live in right now requires us to develop values, knowledge, and skills for collaboration, mutual support, and socially responsible interaction. So what is a cosmopolitan identity? In this case, we understand, the research tells us that a cosmopolitan identity is one that allows for adaptability and flexibility, self-development through engagement with cultural diversity, being open to a subject or others' perspectives and values, reflecting on conceptions of home in the world, traveling for self-transformative cultural experiences, and engaging in a quest for a sense of community. These experiences present a setting in which to learn about global diversity and the interrelationships and interconnectivity of issues across the world's population today. These include opportunities through educative dialogues and meaningful discourses about ourselves, about who we may be and who others may be, and the differences and similarities across culture, language, spirituality, politics, sexuality, and about international cultural contexts, practices, beliefs, understandings, and communication. And Oxfam has some recommendations that also include asking questions and thinking critically, exploring local global connections and our own worldviews, values, and assumptions, exploring the complexities of global issues and engaging with multiple perspectives, and exploring issues of social justice locally and globally. These are some methodologies. I know some folks were interested in methodologies for learning. I don't know that it's always about fun, although I appreciate a good fun learning experience. Storytelling is first and foremost with regard to cosmopolitan philosophy development, as well as reflections on those frames of references we talked about, reflecting on our stereotypes, experiences that allow us to bring awareness of the world to ourselves and our learners, which can include travel, but also case studies, music, book clubs, studies of histories, religions, and politics. A travel with a goal to connect with people, educating on responsible media usage, learning about how to consider policies and consumer choices, learning foreign languages, establishing and maintaining global friends and enlarging our neighborhoods, and encouraging everyone to vote. Finally, Baumgartner and Johnson Bailey add that instructors of cross-cultural education must support learners' emotional resilience and flexibility through positive intercultural exchanges. It's important to be aware of emotional roadblocks that can include the inability to regulate emotions that can contribute to poor rather than successful outcomes. and to provide a safe space with sensitive dialogue that engages learners' emotions effectively. So as we think about these issues that have been circulating around the world for some time now, I contend that cosmopolitan adult learning and teaching are essential for finding collaborative solutions, empathy, respect for difference, social equity, and love for humankind. So as I close, it'd be great if you would reflect on some of the things we've talked about today and think about what's in your metaphorical traveler suitcase. What are those frames of mind that you carry on with you? What are your curiosities, expectations, and needs that characterize your interactions with people who are similar as well as different? And how do you hope to expand and develop your identity through those physical, intellectual, and emotional cross-cultural experiences? I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that we have time for.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Coryell, and we appreciate all the wealth of information and so much information about this topic. I understand how important this is, but also how complex and how so many different ways and methodologies are at play. We have a few questions that are clarifying questions, and then we have some questions that are more general. So I will start with those that are requiring some clarification. The last question actually in the Q&A was asking about what is the difference between cultural cosmopolitanism and acculturation. And I think if you explain that, that can also help understand the other pieces of cosmopolitanism that you shared with us, the other components or the types of cosmopolitanism.
Sure, that's a great question.
Versus, yeah, cultural cosmopolitanism.
Cultural cosmopolitanism and acculturation. So the idea of acculturation is when someone who is new to a particular culture is either forced to or tries to take on the identities of the people within their living. Cultural cosmopolitanism, which is a personal decision, but it can also be a forced political decision. The difference between that and cultural cosmopolitanism is a decision to value one's own experiences, one's own people, one's own familiarities and values, but also to be very open-minded and value, respect those of others that could be very, very different. And my feeling about cultural cosmopolitanism is that it is a positionality of constant learning, of constant open-mindedness and constant learning, because for those who identify as cultural cosmopolitans, whether they know that term or not, I believe very strongly that they're looking at the world and its peoples and its cultures in ways that can help to enhance their own understandings of the world. And so sometimes perhaps a cultural moray or a value could be incorporated into a cultural cosmopolitan's understandings frame of reference. Doesn't have to be. It's not an acculturation process, but it's an openness to that possibility and the enhancement to oneself as well as those peoples around them of the valuing of that openness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. The second clarifying question is regarding the video on the reflection. Someone asked, can you explain what was the main theme in that reflection on those models, the drawings that the video shared?
Sure, that's on experiential learning in adulthood. And the point is that the main point here, there's a cycle for it in the theory, but the main point here is that that adults do and need to engage in reflection about the components of a new phenomenon that happens in their life, new knowledge, if you will, or new experience that they engage in or see or are a part of. So the idea that the first stage in the cycle is to think about what just happened, like what are the facts of what just happened, and the second thing is how do I feel about those things? What were my feelings around those? To reflect on what are those feelings around that experience, and then in the third stage, it's about what what sort of personal theories do I now understand about this phenomenon, about the world, about the meaning I'm making of it, that I can then put into action to experiment with those theoretical ideas about this new knowledge and how it fits into my experiences, to become a part of who I am and what I know. So the focus is on reflection after having an experience, a concrete experience with a new phenomenon or with new knowledge. I hope that's answering the question.
Yes, I think that's very clear. So I have a few others that are more general.
Okay.
For example, when does cultural cosmopolitanism becomes cultural appropriation? Are there any distinctions?
That's a great question, and I think it's a reasonable critique. And I don't know that researchers and theorists have been able to come up with a great answer for that. I will say that I gave you like I think 4 or 5 types of cosmopolitanism. I mean, I talked about 4 or 5 types, but there are a lot more than that. And so I think that as we continue with research on social experiences and cross-cultural, cross-national experiences, that those distinctions will be better examined. But I think it's an important critique that we want to be careful of, because respecting diversity and respecting difference doesn't mean being able to take over someone's culture and become that culture. I think it's about understanding, learning from, and there is the idea that through cosmopolitanism, sort of generally writ large, that we are citizens of the world, or we're citizens of all cultures, and but we need to be really careful that we are continuing to respect the diversity that's out there and not trying to become something that takes lifetimes and generations to become.
Right, and you know how in the US we say that, you know, multiculturalism is all about the salad bowl rather than bringing everyone into the melting pot.
That's right.
It seems to me that in cosmopolitanism there's more of a salad bowl than melting.
Than the melting pot, yes.
Where everyone comes together.
That's right.
Whatever they have into the formula, into the interaction and the relationship. At least that's my understanding.
No, it's an excellent way of thinking about that. Absolutely. The difference between, and I assume that most people have heard about this kind of, we used to be called the melting pot, and now we are trying to talk about, no, not really. We're really more of a salad. And so we're not really melting into each other so much as we are being able to continue with our diversities and our specific differences to celebrate all of those, but still yet together.
Yes. And just to say to everyone, I already responded several times, we don't have certificates for webinars. I apologize for that. I would like to have a few more questions actually that people asked. So there is a question here, if people didn't get enough attention, the psychological attention growing up, can these people be taught as adults through andragogy? That's
an interesting question. Not one that I specifically have a lot of experience with, but I can talk to you about, I think, how adult educators would think about that. That yes, it is possible to teach anyone, but the reality is that every individual adult comes to a learning experience with different, widely different previous experiences and knowledge bases. And so in this case, if we were working with someone who did not get the psychological and emotional support necessary that we think is necessary for child rearing once they get to adulthood, then what we have to do as adult educators is to take our learners where they are, and to begin with them with where they are in that developmental and learning process. And so, yes, we can do that. But it depends. We really have to focus on each individual person and what their needs and expectations are, and start from there.
Wonderful. There's also a question here regarding online learning, the pandemic, and all of that. And I think the gist of several of the questions is about, being citizens of the world, learning online, being with each other. Like right now, we have people from multiple places and countries and time zones.
Yeah.
Can adult learning really happen through this context? Is the use of pictures and videos? How long can we sustain this form of learning? I guess we have several who pointed out, the pandemic and online learning as a platform. What do you think about that? I know this is a recent area of research. I don't know if there is research on the online components with adults, but I'm sure you have insights on that.
Well, the research in terms of online learning has been going on for a good while, of course. What generally the outcome of that research has been is that there is not a significant difference between learning online and learning face-to-face. Now, I, for one, much prefer to be face-to-face. I prefer to learn face-to-face. I prefer to teach face-to-face. So we as adults have learning preferences around this issue that come to play in terms of how the adults decide to learn and perhaps what barriers they put up for themselves if they're in a situation and that doesn't really fit their preferences. In terms of, my hope is that I think my strong belief is that we will not always have to be learning online for the rest of our lives, at least as we consider them. But I do think that online learning will continue. It's a wonderful opportunity for access in many cases, although there are some concerns that not everybody has access, but it does tend to open up access to rural communities, for example, and in distant situations. In terms of learning about each other and about different cultures, that we can do that in so many ways. We have, because of technology and the internet, we can get access to news and stories and movies and music and perspectives across cultures in a variety of ways, and we have been doing that. So can that be brought into formal education in terms of opening up international perspectives, global worldviews into disciplines? Absolutely, and it has been helping in that, and that's been going on for quite some time. Other methodologies, for example, like international field experiences and study abroad and that kind of thing, are obviously very impossible at this moment with the pandemic. Given my full respect for and love for study abroad experiences, not only for my learners, but also for me, I can't wait for that to change. But there are ways to do virtual kinds of experiences. So for example, my university has spent a lot of time and effort and money to create virtual tours of our campus, which is a beautiful, beautiful campus. It brings people, brings students to our university. But we can't do that right now. We can't have students on campus, prospective students on campus that much, or they don't want to come so much. So we have created these virtual tours, which are really beautiful. I think we're going to get better, even better at these kinds of virtual experiences as our technologies are pushed to do so, particularly in a situation like this pandemic. So that was a long answer to not a very long question, but I think it's definitely possible. I don't think it'll be the only way we'll learn, once this pandemic has been brought under control. But I'm glad that we have been able to learn from this experience and utilize these technologies in ways that I think are useful. What's unfortunate in this particular presentation is that because there are lots and lots and lots of people, it's hard to tell our stories to each other. I mean, you've heard my stories, but I don't know your stories. And you don't know each other's stories, perhaps. And so I do think that the bringing down into smaller groups to provide the opportunity to tell our stories, to see each other, to see the hand movements and the things that we do in our body language, but also the inflection in our voices, the values that come through in our decisions. I think that's going to be key.
I totally agree. I mean, I think the human interaction is what makes learning really. And that reflective process where we share our ideas and build on each other, I think it's important.
Absolutely.
To move a little bit further, there is a question regarding, and this question comes up because we have people who are scholars in Islamic studies, in religious studies, and so forth, ethics and values.
Yes.
Of the concepts we also work with. And the question that comes and came from a few people here is, you mentioned religious education, spirituality, faith, and so forth. How much room is there for concepts that are coming from someone's own religion, someone's own faith? How much room is there in this whole idea of cosmopolitanism? And where is religion in all of the theories and all of the, I know it's a big question, but whatever you have on that, I think would be helpful for some people, at least maybe even direct people to some of the literature on that and insights you may have.
Sure. So millions of people around the world will identify first through their religious, through their spirituality, through their religious affiliations. And so when we think about those frames of reference, religion can be a huge influencer on those lenses through which people, adults and sometimes children, see the world. And so the idea of considering adult learning without the importance of those religious influences or the spirituality influences is really not taking into account the whole person. And I think that, so when we think about transformative learning, which is really what the theory that brought in this idea of a frame of reference, it is essential that we ourselves understand what are the influence that I bring into the way I see the world and the way I make sense of what I see and what I understand and what I experience. And so when those disorienting dilemmas come into account, sometimes it affects it always affects, if it's a transformative learning, it always affects those perspectives. And sometimes it affects religious understandings and other times not so much. I think when we have what Apia calls cultural contamination, I'm a little uncomfortable with that word because I don't like the word contamination. Perhaps it's just a personal thing. But when we have cultural contamination, then it is I think it's really a matter of, first of all, knowing really who am I and how am I coming at the world, but then also being open enough to understand how others are coming at the world and asking them to reflect and also to share. And I think the sharing of these things is essential as we have these conversations across cultures, not for judgment purposes. And there may be some judging that happens when, for example, religions don't agree and don't believe in the same things. But by and large, there are a lot of religious studies that have comparative religious studies that have indicated some really strong foundational similarities. And I think it's when we can be open-hearted, we can be listening, and we can be learning from each other that we can bridge across those differences in ways that don't require us to shut the door to someone who doesn't agree with us, but instead have more empathy and understanding. I would have to provide, I don't have any references off the top of my head with regard to this specific issue, but I can certainly look into that and send some things on if that would be of interest.
Sure. So now that we are, on differences and living with differences, this is my question. I'm interested in the question of gender differences. Are there gender differences in the learning, the way adults learn, whether they're females or males?
That's a great question. So there's a whole section of adult education that is through feminist theory and Black feminist thought, for example, and critical feminist theories. And so I would avoid very clearly stereotyping gendered ways of learning, that all women learn this way and all men learn this way. But we have done, there were early studies in the field of adult education that were done only on college males, like at Harvard. And so they were all white males, and they studied how they, you know, what they valued in learning and what their motivations for learning were and that kind of thing. And it was kind of put out there for everyone to say, oh, this is how adults learn. Well, then of course, some women came into it and said, you know, that doesn't really fit with my understanding about how I learn and how my friends learn and how, you know, other women in my life learn. And so then there have been studies on women's ways of knowing. And there are some differences generally, but which, you know, can include, you know, motivations and uses of new knowledge, and women are known more generally to be holistic learners. And so they're looking at not just I need to learn this for this particular reason in my job, but seeing how does this help me to understand the world more generally. But yes, there is a whole strong and rich body of knowledge with regard to feminism and feminist gendered female ways of knowing that are interesting and can come into play with regard to understanding the difference between genders.
Right. And I don't know the literature on adult learning that much in terms of the learning methodologies and so forth and differences. But I would think that, like, for example, self-efficacy that plays a role in children's learning.
Yes.
He also, you know, plays a part in how do I perceive myself? How do I evaluate myself?
That's right.
How I keep my self-esteem as I learn. I think that, like, I try to learn a new language and I'm adult and I feel like, oh, I don't think I can. I'm already like defeating myself saying, I can't, you know, as an adult, as a child, I think, you know, they just learn it, right?
Right,
So,
that's right.
is there literature on like self-evaluation, self-efficacy and?
Absolutely there is, as well as metacognition and self-actualization. And so this idea that, and adults tend to be better at this, although it takes some learning, it's teaching sometimes and learning to be able to think through these things that don't necessarily automatically come to us to think about, but you know, to be able to know how I learn, what I know and how I know it and how I learned it and what I still need to understand. It's a part of this idea of self-efficacy and the idea of self-actualization is another theory that kind of is embedded in this idea that says I'm becoming the person the full person I should become. I want to become. And so that's a part of understanding learning from a lifespan kind of perspective that has a lot of really interesting research and theory surrounding it, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, maybe a follow-up question and we'll wrap up, but this last question is about, someone asked about, can theories of adult learning actually improve education system and close loopholes? And, you know, probably the question I'm just guessing is about teachers' education, professional development, administrators, leadership in education, even policymakers. Is there room for adult learning to improve education system is the question.
I love that question, and I will say that I would not be worth my salt if I didn't say with a very loud and excited answer, yes, adult education, adult learning theory and development need to be influencing so many different sectors of human life, because we are constantly learning. You know, lifelong learning is not just a goal, it's a reality for adults. And so we're learning at work, we're learning in politics, we're learning in our homes, in our relationships. And so I mean, one of the things I mentioned in my presentation was that one of the biggest joys of my life is conducting faculty professional development for university faculty on adult learning theory and practice and teaching methods and that kind of thing, because we're aware that, for example, lecture for 3 hours or hour and a half or any of that is just, it's incredibly difficult for anyone to attend to. And I don't say that lecture doesn't have a valued place, but there are a lot more active and participatory ways of following up a lecture, for example, that will deepen the learning and make learning much more meaningful, new knowledge much more meaningful and embedded in people's experiences and knowledge bases than simply listening to a lecture. that's a little bit funny that I'm saying that, given I just lectured for 40 minutes, but hopefully it was a little bit more interactive, and that was my goal. So yes, I think that the academic discipline, or the field of adult education from research and theory standpoints has a incredible potential to make adults' lives better through what we understand about how adults are developing throughout their lifespan and are continuing to learn and interact. So yes, and if you could spread that news for us, we'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in a master's or doctoral program, please contact me and I'll be happy to tell you about ours.
Wonderful. I hope I was fair and summarized a lot of the questions and comments that were brought up. Some of the participants actually asked if you're willing to share. I think you shared your email, but if you're willing to share the slides, the PowerPoint, so they could read them on their own. But maybe do that, they can just email you, and we can put the email in the chat. Is that okay with you?
Yes, that's just fine.
You can actually.
Okay, let me do that.
Your email.
Sure.
So if you put it in the chat, people can reach out to you to ask for more information. If it's okay with you, I think that will be helpful. I think that, you know, because it's such a rich area of research and you know, a practice, I think it would be important. Thank you so much. Now everyone can see it. And then what we will do, like I said at the beginning, and maybe people didn't hear me, is that make sure that you sign up for the newsletter. We will announce when we have the video available on YouTube. We're gonna probably need to do some editing of it. And I want to sincerely thank you, Professor Coryell, for your presentation, for your time, for your willingness to be with us at IIIT, and I hope that you learned a little bit more about our organization and our work, and hopefully this is the beginning of, you know, many other collaborations.
I think that would be wonderful.
And I'm sorry that we couldn't have the more interactive nature of this, but I guess we're all used to being in Zoom land. I want to thank you all for being with us from everywhere, and I want to thank a lot of the people that our partners in many of the countries that we work with in the research for being on the call. I'm sure it's late for some of you, so I don't want to extend it any longer, but thank you so much and stay tuned. We will be coming back with our launching actually of our annual study mapping the terrain, data analysis, and our report towards the end of the year, inshallah, God willing. And thank you so much. Thank you for IT, and thank you, Salwa, for the media, and we will conclude here. Thanks a lot.